Every story has three sides: yours, theirs, and the truth somewhere in between. For thousands of years, humans looked into the wild places and saw gods, beings with horns that touched the sky, protectors of the forest, guardians of the untamed world. Then everything changed. The gods of nature became demons, the horned protectors became devils, the sacred became sinful. But what if I told you that this transformation wasn't accidental, that the demonization of horned gods like Pan and Cernunnos wasn't just about religion, it was about power, control, and humanity's complicated relationship with wildness itself. At Three Truths Project, we give voice to the forgotten, the twisted, and the true. This is the story of how we turned our gods into monsters. The familiar story goes like this. Ancient pagans worshipped strange gods, half human, half beast. Pan, the Greek god with goat legs and curved horns, who played music in the wilderness. Cernunnos, the Celtic lord of animals, crowned with magnificent antlers. When Christianity spread across Europe, these horned gods were declared false idols. Their animal features, once symbols of nature's power, became proof of demonic origin. The horns that once connected earth to heaven became marks of Satan himself. By the Middle Ages, the transformation was complete. Pan's goat features became the devil's calling card. Cernunnos' antlers marked the Lord of Darkness. The nature gods were reborn as hell's ambassadors. It's a simple story. Paganism fell, Christianity rose. The old gods died or became demons. But the real story? The real story is far more complex and far more revealing about who we are. This is where the story gets interesting. To understand what was lost, we need to go back to the beginning, to understand what Pan and Cernunnos truly represented before they were transformed into monsters. Pan wasn't always a demon. In ancient Greece, he was the god of shepherds, of wild places, of the music that echoed through mountain valleys. His goat legs and horns weren't marks of evil. They were signs of his connection to the natural world. He existed at the boundary between civilization and wilderness, between human and animal, between order and creative chaos. His worship was tied to fertility, to the land's abundance, to the uninhibited energy of nature itself. Yes, Pan was sexual. Yes, he was wild. But these weren't sins. They were acknowledgements of nature's fundamental forces. The Greeks understood that life itself was driven by wild energies that couldn't be fully tamed or controlled. Meanwhile, in the forests of Gaul, another horned god presided over the wilderness. Cernunnos, the name means horned one, was portrayed as a mediator between worlds. Human body, magnificent antlers, surrounded by animals who showed no fear. On the Gundestrup cauldron, crafted around the 1st century BCE, Cernunnos sits in peaceful meditation. In one hand, a torque, symbol of Celtic nobility and power. In the other, a serpent, symbol of transformation and regeneration. A stag on one side, a wolf on the other. Predator and prey, together without violence. Contemporary accounts tell us the Celts saw Cernunnos as lord of the forest, guardian of wildlife, keeper of the balance between abundance and death, growth and decay. His antlers, shed and regrown each year, made him a symbol of nature's endless cycle. Death and resurrection, winter and spring, an eternal turning. What we discover when we look closely is that these horned gods represented something profound: humanity's recognition that we are part of nature, not separate from it. The horns were bridges. They connected the human and animal worlds. They touched both earth and sky. Here's what's interesting. Horned deities appear in nearly every ancient culture. They're not unique to Greece or Gaul. They emerge independently across human civilization. The evidence suggests that horns held deep symbolic meaning for our ancestors. They represented power, the power of the bull, the stag, the ram. They represented connection, reaching up from earth toward the divine. They represented regeneration, antlers that died and were reborn each year. Modern scholars suggest that in worshipping horned gods, ancient peoples were acknowledging forces larger than themselves: the creative power of sexuality, the destructive power of death, the mysterious power of wild places where human rules didn't apply. Pan's wildness wasn't chaos for its own sake. It was the recognition that nature operates by different rules than human society. That spontaneity, sexuality, and untamed energy are fundamental to life itself. His music brought those forces into harmony, not by controlling them, but by celebrating them. Cernunnos, embodied balance. Not the domestication of nature, but peaceful coexistence. Not dominion over animals, but kinship with them. His crossed legs and calm expression suggest meditation, wisdom, a deep understanding of the cycles that govern all living things. The rituals that honored these gods took place in wild spaces, not in temples built by human hands, but in groves and glades where nature's presence was overwhelming. Offerings were made, dances were performed. Communities gathered to attune themselves to seasonal rhythms, to animal spirits, to forces both nurturing and dangerous. What we know for certain is this: for thousands of years, horned gods represented humanity's covenant with wildness. They weren't demons, they were teachers. They reminded us that we belong to nature, not nature to us. And then came the transformation. Christianity's expansion across Europe wasn't just a spiritual revolution. It was a cultural transformation that redefined humanity's relationship with the natural world. The new religion brought a different worldview. Humanity wasn't part of nature's web. Humanity was above it, made in God's image, granted dominion over the earth. The body wasn't sacred. It was fallen, prone to sin. Sexuality wasn't creative power. It was temptation. The wilderness wasn't holy. It was dangerous, testing grounds where demons dwelled. Historical records show a systematic campaign to replace pagan sacred sites. Springs dedicated to water spirits became shrines to St. Bridget. Groves where Cernunnos was honored were cut down, replaced with churches. The sacred geography of the old world was being rewritten. Yet something interesting happened in this process. Christianity needed an image for Satan. The Bible's descriptions were vague: a dragon, a serpent, a fallen angel. But that wasn't visceral enough. It wasn't immediate enough. So the new religion borrowed. Pan's goat legs became Satan's. His horns became hell's crown. His cloven hooves became the devil's step. The beard, the wild hair, the muscular, animalistic body, all transferred wholesale from the pagan god of nature to Christianity's embodiment of evil. Cernunnos suffered the same fate. His antlers marked forest demons. His cross-legged meditation became the devil's throne. His peaceful animals became witches' familiars. The transformation was deliberate and devastatingly effective. By the medieval period, the demonization was complete. Witch trial records from across Europe describe the devil appearing with horns. Not metaphorical horns, literal, physical horns like a goat or stag. When the accused spoke of worshipping horned figures in the forest, authorities heard confirmation of Satan worship. What had once been sacred became forbidden. What had once been holy became heresy. The forest, once a cathedral, became a threat, and the gods who had protected it became demons who haunted it. But here's what we need to understand. This wasn't accidental. The demonization of horned gods served a strategic purpose. Pagan worship was difficult to control. It happened in natural settings, without official priests or centralized authority. It celebrated forces, sexuality, wildness, cycles of death and rebirth that emphasized nature's power over human institutions. Christianity offered something different: hierarchy, structure, laws that could be enforced. But to consolidate power, it needed to eliminate alternatives, not just defeat them, delegitimize them entirely. The evidence points to a calculated strategy. By making pagan gods into demons, Christian authorities achieved several goals simultaneously. They explained why these gods had seemed powerful. They were demons after all, gifted with dark abilities. They explained why pagan worship had felt meaningful. Satan was a great deceiver, and they gave their followers a clear moral boundary. Worship of nature gods wasn't just wrong, it was literally demonic. Fear became the tool of conversion. If the old gods were demons, then honoring them imperiled your immortal soul. If the forest was Satan's domain, then the old ways weren't just obsolete, they were spiritual suicide. Contemporary chronicles tell us that laws were enacted across Christianizing Europe. Penalties for offering sacrifices in groves, punishment for honoring horned gods, death for those who persisted in the old ways. What we discover is that the demonization wasn't about truth, it was about control. It was about replacing one system of power with another. And the horned gods, with their wild associations and decentralized worship, had to be transformed into everything the new order opposed. Still, we need to ask, what was lost in this transformation? The demonization of nature gods fundamentally changed how Western culture related to the natural world. If wildness was demonic, then it needed to be controlled, tamed, or destroyed. If animal nature was sinful, then human animal nature, sexuality, instinct, embodied experience, became sources of shame rather than celebration. What had been sacred became merely useful. Forests became resources to be harvested. Animals became objects to be dominated. The body became an enemy to be subdued. The transformation of Pan and Cernunnos into demons paralleled a larger shift, from participation in nature to dominion over it. The witch trials crystallized these fears. Historical records show that accusations often involved nature-related crimes, meeting in forests, dancing around fires, worshipping horned figures. These were echoes of ancient pagan practices, now reinterpreted as Satan worship. The wild woman became the witch. The horned god became the devil. What we know for certain is that something broke during this period. A connection that had existed for millennia between humans and the wild places, between consciousness and instinct, between culture and nature, was severed. And in its place grew fear, shame, and alienation. The real story of the horned gods isn't just about religious transformation. It's about what happens when a culture decides that part of human experience, the wild part, the untamed part, the part that can't be fully controlled, is evil rather than sacred. Fast forward to today. We live in the most controlled, most tamed, most civilized era in human history. We've achieved what Christianity promised: dominion over nature. And we're beginning to understand the cost. Over the past century, something interesting has emerged. Neo-pagan movements have revived the worship of horned gods. Wiccans honor the horned god as consort to the goddess. Druids seek connection with Cernunnos. Modern pagans reclaim Pan not as demon, but as symbol of nature's wild creativity. Even outside organized paganism, there's a hunger for reconnection. Wilderness therapy, forest bathing, nature as healing. We're rediscovering what ancient peoples knew: that wildness isn't something to be conquered, but something we need. What we discover is a reversal. The forces that were demonized, wild nature, animal consciousness, embodied experience, the cycles that govern all life, are being resacralized. Not always with religious language, but with recognition that our disconnection has consequences. Here's the deeper truth. The story of Pan and Cernunnos isn't really about ancient gods. It's about humanity's eternal struggle with the wild, both in the world and in ourselves. We all begin wild, instinctive, connected to our bodies and the natural world. Civilization teaches us to tame that wildness, to control it, to be ashamed of it. This is necessary. We can't function as communities without some restraint. Yet when we go too far, when we decide that wildness itself is evil, we create a different problem. We become alienated from our own nature, from our instincts, from our creativity, from the spontaneous, joyful, untamed parts of being human. Modern psychology is rediscovering what the demonization of horned gods taught us to forget. We need connection with wildness, not domesticated nature, manicured parks and zoos, but real wildness. Places where we're not in control, experiences that remind us we're animals too, sacred rather than sinful. The transformation of Pan and Cernunnos reveals something profound about how cultures maintain power. If you want to control people, convince them that part of themselves is evil. Make them fear their own wildness. Teach them that nature, external and internal, is something to be conquered rather than honored. What changes everything is the realization that horns were never marks of demons. They were symbols of connection between human and animal, between civilized and wild, between the part of us that builds cities and the part that howls at the moon. Cernunnos sitting among predator and prey, holding symbols of power and transformation, crowned with antlers that die and are reborn. This is an image of integration, not domination of nature, but participation in it. Not shame about wildness, but wisdom that incorporates it. Pan, with his wild sexuality and chaotic energy, represents the creative force that can't be fully tamed. Not because it's evil, but because creation itself is wild. Art, passion, innovation, life, these emerge from forces we can guide, but never fully control. The horned gods aren't dead. They never were. They just went underground, waiting in the wild places we've tried so hard to eliminate. In forests, we haven't yet cleared. In instincts, we haven't yet tamed. In the part of human consciousness that remembers we're part of something larger than civilization. The evidence suggests we're at a turning point. As we face environmental collapse, we're being forced to reconsider our relationship with nature, to move from dominion to partnership, from control to connection, from seeing wildness as demonic to recognizing it as essential. Some stories are too important to forget. The demonization of Pan and Cernunnos. teaches us that when we make nature into an enemy, we make enemies of ourselves. When we call wildness evil, we cut ourselves off from sources of creativity, joy, and meaning that we desperately need. The truth, as always, is more complicated. The horned gods weren't demons, but they weren't safe either. They represented forces that don't care about human plans, that can't be fully controlled, that sometimes create and sometimes destroy. Maybe that's why we demonize them. Not because they were evil, but because they reminded us of something we wanted to forget, that we're not separate from nature, that wildness isn't something that happened in the past. It's happening now, in every breath, every heartbeat, every moment we're alive. At Three Truths Project, we give voice to the forgotten, the twisted, and the true. The horned gods are all three, forgotten by mainstream culture, twisted into demons. But the truth they represented, that humanity needs connection with wildness, that truth remains. History hides in plain sight, sometimes in churches that were once sacred groves, sometimes in fears that were once reverence, and sometimes in the wild places we've been taught to avoid, places where the horned gods still dance, waiting for us to remember what we've forgotten. Every story has three sides. This was theirs, this was ours, and somewhere in between, in the space where civilization meets wilderness, lies the truth we're only beginning to rediscover. At Three Truths Project, we give voice to the forgotten, the twisted, and the true. Like, subscribe, and listen closely.